I've come to tell you what I see. There are great darknesses.
You kill me, bitch. That's the joke of all time.
Keep away from the windows. Somebody might blow you a kiss.
Silencio. Silencio.
Don't you like the taste of blood?
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale.
I shall now count from 1 to 10.
We're going to get done, dude!
He hates these cans! Because he's
Welcome to the Church of Cinematic Oblivion. I'm Nick.
And I'm Harry, and today we are bringing you part 1 in our 3-part series on the history of slasher films.
That's right. And tonight we are going so far back into the history of slasher films that we're not even going to be talking about any slasher films.
No, we're going into the BCs even.
Yes. This is Slashers Part 1, Prototypes, 1200 BC to 1973. And you know, we came to this because if you asked me what my favorite genre is, I might say like late era film noir,
maybe art house horror, J-horror.
I might say Japanese Uroguro or Israeli sex comedies,
spaghetti westerns.
But overall, I think the genre that, if I had to pick one, the genre that I find the most aesthetically interesting and quintessentially American and therefore nostalgic for me is slasher films.
Yeah, and when I was like coming up as a child, I remember slashers were going kind of through a rebirth. So before I ever even watched horror movies, slashers are one of the genres that I was really aware of because movies like Scream and stuff were coming out. And then when I was like 12, 13, I got into horror movies. I went back and rewatched all the old slashers from the 70s and 80s, and it's been a huge part in both of ours developments as film nerds and film historians.
Yeah, and you know, I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I also like wasn't allowed to watch slasher movies, which was kind of a big deal in terms of why I think I was attracted to them. They were the movie that was sort of forbidden, you know? And I read a book at the library describing the plot of Nightmare on Elm Street when I was a kid, but I couldn't even see the movie.
Yeah.
This is growing up in the 90s. I went to the library to rent a book which described the plot of a slasher movie. Anyway, I think that the real reason, as I've gotten older, that I've realized that I love slashers so much is that they're the final note in this long history of genre experimentation. There are so many genres that were getting close to what a slasher film eventually was, and it took so much experimentation before we kind of perfected the genre.
Yeah, the slashers are like the soup that you make with all the other pieces that you have in your kitchen.
That's a really good way to put it. And so, with that said, let's get started. This is a 4-part chapter episode. So the total arc of the history is going to be 3 parts, but each episode will have 4 chapters.
And we're starting off with chapter 1, which is Theater of Blood.
He dragged the golden brooches from her dress, and lifting them, struck them upon his eyeballs, crying out, "You have looked enough upon those you ought never to have looked upon, failed long enough to know those that you should have known. Henceforth you shall be dark!" So, I guess if you want to go back to the very beginning of anything that might have had an influence on what eventually became American slasher films, we're going to have to go all the way back to 1200 BC-ish. I mean, no one knows exactly when it was written, but around 1200 BC, someone named Homer might have written something called the Iliad.
Yeah, and I guess we're going to just talk about these very briefly to give you a history of just kind of violence throughout media, or not media, violence throughout literature.
Yes.
So when you have the Iliad, which, as you put, is full of a huge cast of characters who we learn about through violent deaths.
Well, basically, the thing that's interesting about the Iliad is it's, of course, about the Trojan War, and you have so many characters. You have the entire army of Troy and the entire army of Greece, and you only really learn about who they are when they die. And they die in these brutal ways, and it'll be like, a spear went through his eye. He who sat on the farms of Cyprus growing wheat, and his father before him, and his grandfather, and you learn the whole history of someone as they die, and then you forget about them, and you narrow down slowly down to the characters who matter, Achilles, Hector, you know, those characters. In that way, it sort of feels like it.
And then in follow-up Greek tragedies like Oedipus Rex, Antigone, Trojan Woman, very much fascination with gore and bloody death. Medea, which is an interesting one, also fascination with gore and bloody death, and it has what you could consider the first example of, like, psychotic homicidal murder.
We're talking about Medea, not Medea, the Tyler Perry film.
I've always said Medea.
Well, anyway, same namesake, but Medea yeah, you're right, is a play that ends, or specifically I know that Antigone and Oedipus and the Trojan women end in massacres. They end in these bloody massacres, and they're revenge. They're about people who were wronged, or people who are trying to get something that's right for them, and they are destroying themselves in a quest to do what's right, and it usually ends in a massacre or blood.
Which Medea is the same way, except that her final revenge is also an act of psychotic fury and homicidal murder, where she kills her 2 children.
Speaking of killing your children for the sake of insanity or revenge, I think that one story I'd like to pause and focus on comes from Ovid's Metamorphosis. It certainly existed before Ovid's Metamorphosis, but Ovid put it down in writing. Ovid's Metamorphosis was written around 4 AD, and there's a story in there, the story of Procne and Philomela. Procne and Philomela were sisters, and Procne was married to a man named Tereus. I think that's how you say it. Forgive me if I get the pronunciation wrong, Greek listeners. Anyway, Tereus rapes and mutilates Philomela, and eventually Philomela manages to get that information to her sister, Procne. And Procne, upon receiving this information in the form of a tapestry, kills her son with Tereus, their son, Itylos, and feeds him to Tereus. So that is a really good example of the level of gruesome gore and brutality that you see in this ancient theater and ancient myths.
And if that sounds a little familiar, it's because it was later rewritten as Titus Andronicus, and then later rewritten as Game of Thrones.
And then later rewritten as Scott Tenorman Must Die in that episode of South Park.
Very much.
Cartman does that. But Titus Andronicus, which was written around 1588-ish, once again, dates are a little uncertain, by Shakespeare, is one of Shakespeare's earliest, or maybe his earliest, tragedy, in which a wronged king is versus a woman named Tamara. Her sons, Chiron and Demetrius, rape and mutilate his daughter, much like Philomela, and he bakes them into a pie and feeds them to their mother Tamara at this dinner, and it is such a kind of slasher ending to a play.
Very much in the grandiose and theatrical versions of gore and mutilation.
Tell who did the deed.
Why hast thou slain thine only daughter thus?
Not I. It was Chiron and Demetrius. They ravished her and cut away her tongue. And it was they that did her all this wrong.
Confess unto us hither presently.
Why, there they are! Both baked in that pie whereon their mother daintily hath fed, eating the flesh that she herself hath bred. 'Tis true! Witness my knife-sharp bite!
Which brings us to the next genre in our theater of blood, which is Jacobean revenge.
Yeah, Titus Andronicus kind of kicked off Jacobean revenge. It was the end of the Elizabethan era of theater, the beginning of the Jacobean era, and a lot of other plays that had similar gory sequences of revenge and punishment in such plays as The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kidd, The Jew of Malta by Christopher Marlowe, who many historians theorize might have been Shakespeare, same guy, could have been, and The Revenger's Tragedy by Cyril Tournier, yeah. And Shakespeare continued this format in the plays you gotta know if you know Shakespeare at all, which is Hamlet, King Lear, and Macbeth, all of which involve a bunch of chain reactions events that end in gory, bloody massacres.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, I see the Shakespeare tragedies as the prototypes of slasher films.
In some ways, they lack a lot of the format, which we'll get to later, but they do have the idea of a past trauma or a past crime leading to multiple other deaths and murders.
Yeah, and the chain reaction style, too. And often, young people, like Hamlet and King Lear, are both about supposedly teenagers who are involved in all this violence. Then again, what it meant to be a teenager was really different than it is now. But I think that the first thing that really deserves discussion in terms of influencing slashers comes near the middle of the 19th century, and that is penny dreadfuls. Penny dreadfuls were cheap pulp novels, also called penny awfuls, penny horribles, penny bloods. They included gothic stories about people like Jack the Ripper. Most famously, you would know a penny dreadful character named Sweeney Todd.
Attend the tale of Sweeney Todd. His skin was pale and his eye was odd. He shaved the faces of gentlemen who never thereafter were heard of again. He trod a path that few have trod. Did sweet
Johnny Depp movie, maybe from the Sondheim musical that the Johnny Depp movie is based on. But Sweeney Todd first appeared in an 1846 penny dreadful called A String of Pearls. For those of you who don't know, Sweeney Todd is a barber who... originally, he had no motive. I think a play later on that Sondheim copied added in this motive that he'd been wronged by a judge and falsely imprisoned. But originally, he was just crazy. And he would... he ran a barbershop where if you came to get yourself shaved, he'd cut your throat, throw you backwards down a hole where a woman below would bake you into a pie. Much like Titus Andronicus,
it all comes full circle.
This baking people into pies thing is a recurring theme through a lot of old theater. So penny dreadfuls were definitely a huge influence. But there's no doubt that in the pre-cinematic era, the thing that had the greatest influence on what eventually became slasher films was...
The Grand Guignol, which is a theater in Paris that was opened in 1897 and later closed in 1960s. I don't know the exact year, but in the 60s. And the name literally means big puppet.
Grand Guignol.
Yeah, and it specialized in what they called theater of blood. And they were these horror plays that often involved madness or revenge. And they lacked the format of a slashers, but they had almost all the same content. They were very gory. They were really well known for their bloody special effects and just splattering the stage with fake blood. They often had a lot of sex and nudity, and they were very exploitative, and they were often about young people. I read a couple of them. I read one called The Orgy in the Lighthouse that is very much like a slasher. It's about these two men who work in a lighthouse, and then these two women show up, and they seduce them and have sex with the women, and while they're having sex with them, the lighthouse goes out because the men aren't paying attention, and when they go relight it, they see that their parents' ship has stranded on the shore.
Oh shit.
So they're furious, and as revenge, they slit one of the women's throats, and then they light the other one on fire.
Jesus.
And that's the end of the play.
It's fucking video nasty.
Yeah, it's very much.
That's brutal.
And I saw photos from it, and they do the effects great. They show a photo of one of the performances, and it shows them, drawing the fake blood across the woman's neck, and it's like pouring down.
Good
and then
God.
The other one, they have her standing in a doorway, and there's a bunch of jets in front of her blowing up flames, and she's standing like feet behind them. It's supposed to be her on fire. Really good stuff. Very much appeasing to the exploitation crowd.
Right, so this is like the Tom Savini of the gay 90s theater, basically.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's all about the bloody special effects.
Very much.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
So, I read another one called A Crime in the Madhouse, and we're going to act out a little scene for you guys today.
Back to my Evening Shadows days. Here we go.
So, let me just set up the story a little bit. This is from a short 2-act, it would probably be about a 30-minute performance, called A Crime in the Madhouse, and it's about this young, innocent girl, Louise, is in the madhouse, and she's about to get out, but the sister has to make her stay one more night in the madhouse with her 3 roommates, Hunchback, One-Eye, and the Normandy Woman.
Okay, so I'm going to play One-Eye.
Yeah, you're going to play One-Eye and Hunchback,
okay,
and I'm going to be the Normandy Woman and Louise.
By the way, I'm pretty sure, I don't know, in the 1890s were women allowed to act? Because in the Shakespeare era, men would have played women.
So this play is actually from 1925.
Oh, okay.
Because it was around throughout up until...
No, that's perfect, because 1925 is the year before the first film we're going to discuss in Chapter 2.
Yes, okay.
So that couldn't be more perfect.
So this is Crime in the Madhouse from 1925, all right?
Bring the bedlight closer. Here, closer.
Hunchback obeys. Normandy Woman staring at Louise. People say she's already dead. Yes, like a corpse.
No, when I am finished, the cuckoo will return to us.
Ah!
Uncovering Louise's mouth.
Do you know who I am, child?
Where am I?
Stop moving.
Catching a glimpse of them. What are you doing to me?
Don't scream. We don't want to do anything to you. Only to those 2 eyes.
My eyes?
Those are not your eyes.
She thinks those are her eyes. Ha 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 ha.
With authority.
Quiet, you two. Don't you understand, my little one? It's a service I want to render you. You were crazy once, weren't you? Don't you remember?
Of course she does.
She doesn't remember. While you were crazy, a beast got inside you. A cuckoo bird. She hid in your head behind your eyes.
Louise struggling. Ah!
If you continue to scream, I'm going to have to shut you up good, so listen to me. I'm going to rid you of the bird, do you understand? She has stolen your eyes. The bird has removed your eyeballs and put hers in your sockets. Do you understand now? Those damned cuckoo's eyes are planning to rob me of my sight.
No, have pity, please.
Now you understand.
I beg of you.
It'll be good for you.
Please, I don't want to die.
You won't die.
Help me.
Her hand over Louise's mouth.
Shut up! To the women. Hurry before the screams begin.
One-Eye gags her with the piece of cloth, which also covers her entire face.
Resisting.
Don't move, little one. It will be over soon. I only have to feel exactly where your eyes are. But this cloth is too stiff. It's been starched.
What?
Too much starch in the cloth, idiot! Soak the damn thing in water and dry it on the stove. I must know precisely where her eyes are, Normand.
One-Eye grabs the cloth from Louise's face and flings it at the Normandy woman. One-Eye again silences Louise with her hand. Now in a panic, the Normandy woman repeatedly dips the cloth in a water basin and throws it on the stove, which sends up plumes of steam.
Why did you give me a starched cloth?
It's soft now, look, it's completely soft. The Normandy woman spreads the steaming cloth over Louise's face.
One-Eye clinically touches Louise's covered face and smiles. With her other hand, she pulls the knitting needle from her pocket and quickly rams it through the cloth into Louise's eye socket.
With the new intensity screaming, "No!"
There, that's it. Blood is flowing on my hands. It's warm. It's good. It's just like the blood of an infant. A tiny, beautiful child.
One-Eye stabs Louise's other eye.
Like the old times.
One-Eye laughs hysterically and makes flapping gestures as she dances around Louise's tortured body.
In reflexive motion, the blinded Louise pulls the knitting needle from her second destroyed eye and leaps up from the bed as the bloody cloth falls to the ground. Vitreous fluid flows down Louise's mutilated face, which is frozen in a silent scream. Normandy woman confused as she runs towards Louise. "The bird! Where's the bird?"
Louise instinctively ignores the Normandy woman, lunges toward the laughing One-Eye and falls dead, holding the needle.
Normandy woman, inspecting the corpse of Louise. "The cuckoo didn't fly out. Hunchback, did you see the bird?"
The crones stare at each other in disbelief as One-Eye continues her demented dance. Realizing that they had been tricked, Hunchback suddenly overpowers the ecstatic One-Eye and drags the uncomprehending ogress across the room to the stove. Hunchback forces the unseeing side of One-Eye's face down onto the hot red plate. The face sizzles away in a burst of bloody steam as One-Eye screams wildly. Hunchback lifts up the ogress's oozing head by her hair and smashes her one eye against the stove plate, killing her.
Long pause. Hunchback looks at the Normandy woman. Normandy woman coming out of her shock. "There never was a cuckoo." Noise from the right is heard.
"Normand, listen. Footsteps."
Hunchback blows out the bed lamp and climbs into her bed. The room is bathed in moonlight. Normandy woman realizing their predicament. "They're coming! They're coming!" She scrambles into bed and pulls a sheet over her head. A pause. Steps can be heard. The sister from off stage. "I assure you, Sister Agnes, I did hear noises." Enters holding a lantern. "What is it? Did someone cry out?" She stops at the threshold. Silence.
Second sister, entering.
"No, just as I said."
Illuminating only the sleeping forms of the Normandy woman and Hunchback. Asleep. Everything is quiet.
"I told you, it's nothing at all. And you know Mother Superior doesn't like it when we leave before the end of the service."
A lyrical Vespers chant of female voices can be heard in the distance. The sister while leaving. "Yes, I was mistaken. Let's return for communion."
The sisters exit with the lantern. After the door is shut, the curtain falls slowly on the Normandy woman and Hunchback as they rise up in their beds and begin to cackle in the moonlight.
Ha 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 ha. And that is the last 5 pages of A Crime in the Madhouse, a Grand Guignol classic.
So if you have a problem following audio drama, just to explain what just happened, 3 crazy ladies stabbed the eyes out of a young lady and did it because they thought a bird was trapped in her skull, right? That was the basic gist.
That was the idea. And then when they found out there was no bird, they burn and murder one of the other crazy women.
And the way that would have been done on the stages of the Grand Guignol in Paris in 1925 would have been with some of the most illustrious and effective special effects.
I saw some awesome photos of it, and they have them holding down Louise and stabbing her in the eyes, and then they show how they do the one-eye trick where they burn one eye on the stove, and it's like a pipe with a lantern under it.
Oh, cool.
Not a real lantern, not a flame lantern, but like an electric lantern, so that there's like light coming out of it, and then they hold her head down on it, and there's like a steam effect. Mm-hmm. Really inventive stuff to give the audience that real visceral gory feeling.
Yeah, and I just want to say apologies for my British accent. I know at times it's working and at other times it doesn't. This was not rehearsed. We just went straight off the
Nick
fly.
Doesn't want to ruin his acting reputation out there.
Listen, if I have proper prep time, I can do much better. That was just a complete on the fly reading the script. Yeah. I'm not off book.
So anyway, that's the Grand Guignol. And it closed. It was really popular in its heyday, but it closed in the 60s because it wasn't doing super well post-World War II. They theorized that after World War II, people kind of had enough of horrible death.
Yeah, it probably was as a result of, there was so much horror in the world that people wanted something a little more, I don't know, how do you say it? Melodramatic?
But also, theater took a backseat to film. So why don't we move over to film, as this is a film podcast, and get to chapter 2.
So yes, we are now moving on to the era when cinema entered the scene. And of course, some of the earliest things done in cinema were horror films. It was one of the first things, other than porno, that people wanted to see.
Yeah.
So chapter 2, Old Dark Houses.
You'd like me to tell you all about fire, would you?
Yes, I wish you would.
Well then, first of all, I've learned that flames are really knives. They're cold, my friend. Sharp and cold as snow. They burn like ice.
So, even before the Grand Guignol play that we just read, there was actually an Old Dark House film. Back in 96.
Yeah.
Mr. George...
Jorge Méliès is what I've always said.
Jorge Méliès?
Jorge Méliès.
If you don't know who this guy is, there's a great children's film, Hugo, all about him.
Yeah.
But he made a film in 1896 called The Haunted Castle. It was 10 minutes long. It was silent. It was incredibly primitive filmmaking. And
it was not 10 minutes long.
Yeah.
It was about 2 minutes long.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
It's even shorter. It's like a Nickelodeon.
Yeah.
And it's just gags. It's basically just stop motion gags of skeletons and ghosts.
It's like a demon messes with these two knights in a haunted castle.
I'm sure you're all familiar with the trope of the haunted house.
Right.
These aren't really haunted house movies, though.
No, these are old dark house movies.
Yeah.
But it's a similar setup where it's usually somebody breaks down or somebody needs to get shelter, and for one reason or another, they end up in a mysterious old dark house with a family that's been living in that house for generations.
Right. That will come up again in the beginning of slashers when we get to weird families like the Texas Chainsaw family.
Yeah.
Or
the Bates family.
Or the Bates family. Right. Basically Ed Gein's family. The Geins. But a lot of old dark house films are about weird families, or they're about a bunch of people in sort of just a creepy location with a lot of different motives. It's almost kind of like a soap opera. You know?
Yeah, very soap opera-esque. Very, like, old melodramatic novel, too.
So one of the earliest old dark house films in the kind of beginning of the real booming film era, silent era, is called The Bat. This film is based on a play from 1920, also called The Bat. It has a lot of things going for it, and it is actually mostly known for inspiring Batman.
Right, that's what its most cultural recognition comes from, was from being the direct inspiration for Batman. And you see that pretty directly, but we're not really going to pick that apart. We're here more to talk about its influence as a proto-slasher.
What's interesting is whenever we're talking about films that are this old, the influence branches in many directions. So like, one film can create slashers and supervillains and splatter all at the same time, and even comedies, because Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin did a comedy called Scared Stiff that's totally an old dark house comedy, and I think Abbott and Costello did one too. But The Bat is about a bunch of it's like a bunch of characters. We're not going to go through the whole list, but a bunch of characters are hanging out in a house, some old ladies, some old men, and what do you want to say?
I couldn't keep track of
who cares? A maid. It's incredibly complex. The maid's daughter is sneaking her boyfriend in, pretending he's the gardener, and meanwhile, a bank robber named The Bat is literally dressed in not like a Batman outfit, which would make more sense.
No, but like a monster costume.
It's completely impractical.
Yeah.
It's like a full rubber suit with a giant bat head. Looks like a giant bat. It's clearly meant for intimidation. And the Bat has just done a big heist and is trying to hide in the countryside.
He killed that guy for his jewels.
Right. And now he's trying to hide in the countryside. And he sneaks into this house and he's making people disappear and killing people. He's like a slasher, he's like what will later be viewed as a slasher villain, like Freddy or Jason, which we'll talk about later. I think some of the things that are interesting though is this did influence Batman in the sense that there was the bat signal and the bat
and the grappling hook and like the tool belts and all that stuff.
Yeah, some Batman influence, but that's not an accident, because slasher villains and supervillains have only one important difference. I didn't tell you this before the podcast because I wanted to see if you could think of. I thought about it long and hard. What's the difference between like the Joker from Batman?
I know.
And
slasher villains kill one by one.
That's a good point, too.
And the Joker would kill hundreds at a time.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, but what I was going to say is urban setting versus rural setting.
Oh, very much,
is the main difference. Or suburban setting.
Yeah.
Urban setting creates a supervillain because they do their crimes in the light of day for everyone to see. And slasher villains kill in a location where they're kind of going to operate mysteriously for a while. So like the Bat is operating in an old dark house, which is before, it was like dances or sleepaway camps or, teenage parties. The location of the 30s for slasher villains to work their havoc was old dark houses.
Yeah.
I imagine in the 30s that was a place that a lot of people who went to the movies could relate to, a weird old dark house.
Well, do you want to talk about the Bat as a movie?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't like it. I thought it was pretty... I understand some elements of it are important for later films we're going to talk about, but I just feel like it had ideas that were so much better done later, and its big flaws we're going to find in Old Dark House movies and in Giallos later to come, which is that it's so concerned with plot, character relationships, and like fake outs that it becomes boring.
Yeah.
There are so many characters in this movie to keep track of. None of them have defining characteristics. It's just about what they've done. So like this guy is a burglar and this guy is hiding out from the police. And there's so many like twists, but it's just too much plot and not enough of what you're there for, which is the creepiness, the vigilanteism, or rather the criminalism in this movie, the kills, the mystery, the darkness, but you get a lot of characters in rooms talking about scandal.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think that this is one of the main things that was improved upon even before the slasher in the Giallo, which we'll get to, is that when you have this many characters and you have a slasher villain, it's not just for the sake of violence that you kill them off one by one. It's for the sake of the audience. The audience gets to go from having to track 10 characters to getting to track 9, 8, 7, 6. It makes the movie take up speed and momentum as it goes. Because as you lessen the characters, it becomes easier to follow. You become more invested in the story.
It's like a very literal way to do pacing.
Yeah, and a very literal way to do focus, Obviously, in a work of fiction, having to go from keeping track of 10 to keeping track of 4 to keeping track of 2, and then 1 when we have our final girl is, a satisfying kind of story. Or, or 2 with the villain
and
plus the final girl.
And we don't get that in the Bat.
No.
We don't get that in really any of these Old Dark House movies, but a few of them were done better than this.
You do get it in 1, and we'll get to that. Right. The one that finally figured that out is the one that really cemented the slasher genre. And we'll get to that later. It's, Miss Christie. But I do want to just say briefly that the Bat had a kind of cool ending where they confront the Bat, they find out who the Bat is, it's Scooby-Doo style, pull the monster mask off, and it's one of the characters that's been there the whole time, tricking everyone. And there's this old lady who's always knitting. Throughout the entire movie, she's knitting. And at the end, the Bat has a gun, and he goes, "Put it down." She goes, "Why would I put it down? I took the bullets out of that gun, hours ago." And then he looks scared, and they jump at him, and the gun goes off, and it had a bullet in it. And she says, "The only lie in an otherwise virtuous life." And she's the kind of snarky, cunning, clever, brave character who will later become the final girl. Now, in this kind of silent film, it made sense for it to be an old woman because old women are more experienced and therefore more wise. Taking that quality and putting it on teenagers later in slashers will make the defining characteristic of a final girl precociousness.
And that is interesting because in every one of these Old Dark House movies, there is an old woman as a primary character, but this is the only one where the old woman is in a way heroic. Mm-hmm. In all the other ones, she's kind of a victim or a villain.
I just want to close out the Bat by saying it was remade multiple times. It was remade in 1930 as The Bat Whispers, which was pretty terrible. They reduced the cool costume to just like a prom night style.
Which was the only part of the movie I liked was the costume. I didn't like the broad comedy, and I didn't like the character dramas. I liked the costume and a couple moments of creepiness.
Right, and then they did remake it again in 59 with Vincent Price, and that one was actually pretty good. Even though they reduced the costume again to the prom night style ski mask, the killer this time, the Bat, had claws, like Freddy Krueger claws, and killed with them, and was much more of a psycho killer than just like a cat burglar,
Why, what does it say about the Bat? His specialty seems to be killing women. My goodness, 2 of them in one night. All his victims died the same way, like their throats had been ripped open with steel claws.
That's a charming little caper. I'll have to try it sometime.
Okay, now if we're going to talk about old dark house films, we have to talk about The Old Dark House.
Right, from 1932.
Jinx.
With our boy Boris Karloff, and if anybody doubts that this is the same Boris Karloff from Frankenstein, well, they should just see this picture.
Also, no, if we're talking about who's my boy in this movie, it's fucking Charles Laughton.
Charles Laughton.
I love that guy.
Turning in a wonderful performance as this goofy North English.
We saw him as Captain Bligh a little while ago, and he's a totally different character in this. Yeah. I gotta say, I'm starting to think Charles Laughton might be one of my favorite actors of all time.
Yeah, he's pretty fantastic.
He's so great. I love his accent.
Nothing like roast beef when a man's hungry. Oh, the roast beef of old England. How does that go? Do you remember that, Mr. Waverton, or was that before your time? Pendrell's our song expert. Oh, so you're musical, are you? Well, I've got a bit of an ear myself.
The Old Dark House, I think I have more of a connection for this film for personal reasons. I'm going to tell a quick story. When I was a little kid, we grew up in Palo Alto. There's this old theater called the Stanford Theater, and
which is the only good thing in Palo Alto these days.
Hot take. Okay, but anyway, my dad and I were walking down University Avenue. This was in the 90s, and we passed the Stanford Theater around October, around this time of year, and it was showing a film that just said The Old Dark House. I remember seeing that on the marquee, and my dad saying, "Oh, I don't know what that is," and me as a 9-year-old saying, "Well, I bet it's cool, let's go check it out." And my dad takes me in, and we walk in, and the coolest thing about the Stanford Theater is they have this old man who would play the organ before every show like an old school movie theater. And we walk in, and he is collapsed, leaning on the organ, and it's just going... It's just holding one note. He looked dead. My dad and I laughed because we thought it was some sort of Halloween prank, but he stays on it forever, and then the organ slowly descends into the structure as it did, because it was on like a track that would go up and down. And then this guy comes on the stage and says, "So the organ player had a little heart attack, and we're gonna be dragging him out behind the screen. Please enjoy The Old Dark House." And I remember as a kid being so proud of the fact that I saw a horror movie and wasn't scared. Wow. Which is, when you grow up and watch this movie, you realize it's not that great an accomplishment.
It's really not a horror movie. So we just rewatched this movie with our dad.
Because Dad was visiting, and I was like, "Do you remember this?" And he was like, "Absolutely not. I have no memory of that happening."
Yeah, and we watched it, and he was as bored as I was.
Well,
it's not a horror movie.
No, it's not.
The number one thing to say.
It's really
it starts off with the classic setup of car breaks down in a storm. They go into this old dark house for shelter. There is a weird, creepy family. They have a madman as a servant who is played by Boris Karloff. And he's just this kind of howling barbarian. There's a creepy old brother and sister who live there. And there's a rumor that there might be a grandfather somewhere upstairs.
Yeah, this is your standard Texas Chainsaw style family.
Except the majority of the movie is about the stranded people's relationships and them slowly falling in love. And it's very not about the horror in the house. It's kind of just it's like the Breakfast Club. They're just hanging out and telling stories and getting to know each other overnight.
It's more like an episode of The British Office where it's a really awkward night where no one can go anywhere because the storm has forced them all to be together.
And then at the end, there's that crazy old man, the one who's sick in bed, and then the other one who's
Saul,
super into fire.
The one part where it gets a little slashery is that the crazy brother breaks out of the attic and he tries to burn the whole house down, but they quickly overcome him, and it's not much of a slasher.
And Boris Karloff goes nuts at one point and attacks them.
Right.
But the majority of the movie is kind of comedic. It actually has some funny parts and kind of romantic. The main storyline is this one weird British guy falling in love with that woman who's Charles Laughton's mistress.
Charles Laughton's sexless mistress.
Right. He just keeps her around for appearances. It defines this as a genre, but it doesn't do anything interesting. The Old Dark House genre, I will say right up front, is not a genre I particularly like.
No, it's too complicated, but it's important.
It's important, but it's so soap opera-y.
There's one Old Dark House movie / book which is fantastic.
We'll get there, but next we want to talk about Night of Terror, which is just a slightly better version of the Old Dark House. The thing that makes it better is that there are murders going on, and it introduces us to our very first maniac murderer.
We open with, this is a 30s movie, 2 teenagers making out in a car, and a maniac stalks up and stabs both of them. How slasher do you get?
Yeah, and this is, we should say, pre-code, so they were able to get away with a little bit more. It is a pretty violent movie from its era, and this is the first Old Dark House movie that actually has a lot of murders in it. It has about 5 or 6 murders in it, which is like more than we've gotten with The Bat had 2, I think.
Yeah.
Like more than we get with any of the previous movies. So this is really where you get the being killed off one by one situation, even though only about 3 of the main characters get killed off.
Yeah.
It starts that ball moving.
Night of Terror, the basic plot, this is maybe one of the few Old Dark House films I want to pause and talk about because I kind of liked it.
It was pretty good. I didn't love it, but I thought it was fine.
It's Bela Lugosi is kind of the marquee star of this film.
But he's like a side character, just like Boris Karloff in the other movie.
Right, they just used him for marquee appeal. But he is an important character. Basically, a bunch of people are in an old house where this young man is doing an experiment where he believes he can kind of put himself in a coma, be buried alive for 24 hours or something like that, get dug back up, and then take a serum or be injected with a serum that will bring him back to life. And he basically is doing this experiment. And it's kind of a cool setup where they bury him alive, so this very sensitive experiment is going on. And meanwhile, a psycho killer is loose in the house. So it's got these cool elements balanced. But then the other thing I think is interesting is it's transitioning from the practical motives of Old Dark House films into the maniac motives of psycho and slasher films.
But it's also a bit of a hodgepodge because it also has the gypsy couple. The one can see the future and she keeps having like predictions of bad things happening. And then Bela Lugosi at one point has them hold a seance. So it's kind of throwing a lot of shit at the wall.
Yeah.
But which it does keep it interesting. This movie was never boring.
Never boring. No, it was good. The thing that it also has for the first time that I can think of in an Old Dark House film is, I'll give you a clue.
Do you care if I smoke?
I don't care if you burn.
Have one.
Yeah, I'll have one. What kind of a cigarette is this?
It is an Oriental cigarette.
Oriental, eh?
Yeah! There's a part where they smoke weed.
Bela Lugosi tricks a guy into smoking
Bela
weed.
Lugosi, he's trying to stall the cop, right? So he gives the cop a cigarette and he says, like, do you smoke cigarettes? And the guy's like, yeah. He's like, try this. This is an Oriental cigarette.
An Oriental cigarette. And the cop goes, oh, tastes
and he
pretty
smokes
good.
it and falls asleep in his chair.
Passes out.
And I was like, wow, that's the earliest I've ever seen a reference to weed smoking before, like, Reefer Madness or
It's
whatever.
not cool to trick people into smoking weed, okay?
No, drugging people's not.
Just give them a cigarette. It's much it's much better for you.
Yeah,
I can't even say it with a straight face. And I think it's a good one. If you're going to watch one Old Dark House film, I recommend Night of Terror. I really do. And I would tell you who the killer is, but at the very end of the film, the maniac stands up, like you know how in a lot of slasher movies you think the killer's dead, but then they get back up. The maniac stands back up, faces the screen, and says,
I am the maniac. Take heed. I am talking to you. And you. And you. If you dare tell anyone how this picture ends, if you dare reveal who the murderer really is, I'll climb into your bedroom window tonight and tear you limb from limb. I'll haunt you. Good night. Sleep tight. Pleasant dreams.
Also, I just want to note that, like 2 years later, Bela Lugosi was a similar character in another Old Dark House film. But you know what? It was a film that proved that not all Old Dark House films have to be in houses. The film The Phantom Ship from 1935 told a kind of slasher explanation for why all the people disappeared off the Mary Celeste.
And one day we will do a haunted ship episode because there are a lot of those from the 30s and 40s.
Oh, I would love to do that. We should do it on a boat. Yeah.
That'd be, if we could find a way to record on a boat, let's make it happen.
Okay. Finally, we do arrive at an Old Dark House film that's actually an Old Dark House novel. And this novel came out in 1939. So the author, Miss Agatha Christie. Is it Lady Agatha Christie? Was she knighted? I can't remember. The novel was called 10 Little N-Words. Not kidding, that was the original title. Then they decided to be more sensitive and make it 10 Little Indians. And then they decided to be more sensitive and make it And Then There Were None, which is great. That's the title it always should have been. There was no need to be so insensitive. Oh, perhaps it's good to note that we're not going to deny that in the origins of slashers and in slashers themselves, there is some problematic racism, sexism, all of that is there. In Night of Terror, there's a black character who's constantly hilariously terrified. And it's so strange. We had no idea that this was a black stereotype from the 30s, that black people are so scared of everything.
I've seen that in other pre-Cook movies.
Similarly, yes, Agatha Christie did name her best mystery novel 10 Little N-Words, based on the song 10 Little N-Words that everyone apparently knew.
Probably a hit at the time.
You know, when I was in summer camp as a kid, we sang 10 Little Indians. We sang it.
Really?
Yeah, we sang it. And then I think, like, right when I turned...
You sang it the real way?
Just like, what's the one?
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
That's the one. Right. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. All these racist rhymes that we were taught slightly less racist versions of.
Why did they just make new rhymes?
Yeah, no, because I don't want to fucking think of a new song. Soldiers is the one I read, and Then There Were None. Soldier Island, and the new BBC miniseries of And Then There Were None, which is very good, does Soldier Island as well. Yeah. Whereas the 1945 Renee Claire version does 10 Little Indians.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 Little Indians.
10 Little Indians. It's like the nursery rhyme. 10 little Indian boys went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9.
Oh, poor little fellow. Here's to him. And what happened to the others?
9 little Indian boys sat up very late. One overslept himself, and then there were 8.
Then what happened?
You'll find the rhymes on the piano.
It's based on the song 10 Little Indians, 10 Little Soldier Boys.
Well, we're done. We're just going to call it 10 Little Indians from here on out.
We're going to call it And Then There Were None from now on.
Yeah.
Basically, the format, though, is that 10 people, and this is why it's so interesting, 10 people go to an old dark house on an island. They were invited there by a Mr. and Mrs. Owen.
U.N. Owen.
Who they later realize is just a funny name for unknown. Right. They get to the island, and their hosts aren't there. They've all come from different walks of life. They've all come for different reasons. They all are suspicious of each other, and they're all kind of dodgy characters.
Well, then they find out that they get a recording, very much like Saw.
Right.
They play like a gramophone recording.
I want to play a game.
Yeah. And he says that all of you have committed murder.
Right. And lists them off one by one. One of the guys, sent a man to die at war, knowing he would die. One woman encouraged the death. Vera Claythorne, who's kind of our first proto-final girl, even though she's not at all innocent, but she is clever. She arranged a child's death so that her boyfriend could get all of his inheritance. The butler and his wife were taking care of someone who was sick, who they actually made sicker, etc. And what you start to realize is they die. 10 goes to 9, 9 goes to 8, 8 goes to 7, and what we were talking about earlier finally happens.
Yeah, the narrowing of focus, the quickening of pace, it really comes to a head with this novel.
8 little Indian boys traveling in Devon. One said he'd stay right there, and then there were 7. 7 little Indian boys chopping up some sticks, till one chopped himself in half, and then there were 6.
It gets you more and more excited. It's a page turner. You just go right through it because the pace quickens as you go. At the very beginning, 10 characters. If you can get through that first beginning, you're like, oh my god, I got to keep track of 10 characters right off the bat. You're immediately rewarded for your focus by having to keep track of 9, then 8, then 7, and it's all based on the children's song.
4 little Indian boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. 3 little Indian boys walking in the snow. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2.
The place for nursery rhymes is in the nursery.
Don't worry, Judge. He's down to the last Indian. 2 little Indian boys sitting in the sun. One got all frizzled up, and then there was 1. 1 little Indian boy left all alone. Какой ужас. So he went and hanged himself, and then there were none.
There's a lot of things about slasher movies that are present finally in a solidified form in And Then There Were None.
Yeah, we're going to get elements of form and format that will define a slasher movie later appear first in this, which is one-by-one killing.
Yeah, the narrowing of focus, as we said.
A mystery killer. We don't know who's doing the killing.
Right. One of us is the killer, or the killer is among us trope, which is the idea that you've got the characters, and even though the killer is a mystery killer, it's someone in the room.
You know it has to be somebody who you've already met. And the idea of past trauma or a past crime being the motivation for this.
And also the killings in a tableau style, and the killings reflecting the crime. Remember back when we were talking about Theater of Blood, how Titus feeds the rapist children to the mother who encouraged them to commit the crime? In a similar way, let's say one of the people who dies is a judge, and the judge sentenced someone to die who didn't deserve it. And the judge is killed, and his corpse has a towel draped over it to look like a cloak, and a ball of yarn put on his head to look like a judge's wig.
Yeah.
And that's something you'd see in a slasher movie.
The idea of presenting your victims in a theatrical way. Well, a couple weeks ago, we talked about Stage Fright Aquarius, which takes that to an extreme.
Exactly. The tableau style at the end of Stage Fright Aquarius, which we'll talk about maybe briefly in part 3. Just mention. We already talked about it.
Yeah.
Go back and listen to Kabuki Masks.
No, we'll talk about it as we discuss other slashers where that continues to come up.
Right. So I think that everyone should go read And Then There Were None. It's so great. 1939 novel, and there was a 1945 Renee Clair film of it, which was influential at the tail end of the old Dark House style films. There were a few other old Dark House movies. House on Haunted Hill by William Castle.
That's probably the most successful old Dark House movie, and the one that people know the most. People still know that movie. It was remade in the 90s. So I think that it takes it to a more paranormal, supernatural realm, but that's definitely the peak of the old Dark House movie. We're not talking about it in detail because it steers away from the elements that influenced slashers and steers more into haunted house territory.
Right, exactly. But overall, some of the old Dark House films introduced more tropes to the slasher than others. And Then There Were None is incredibly influential. Night of Terror had a lot of tropes in place. Cat and the Canary, The Bat, the old Dark House, the film itself, they don't really feel like proto-slashers.
No.
But they are a part of the influence. One of the biggest things that separates old Dark House films, even the best ones like And Then There Were None, from being slashers is that these are usually films about people who are motivated by practical reasons. Gain, getting money, or revenge, or punishment, or justice. There's a real kind of logical reason to be killing.
Right, which is, I guess, contrasted by the Maniac Killer in Night of Terror, and that Maniac Killer and the idea of a psycho killer would be examined and expanded upon as we move into Chapter 3, which is Psychos.
What do you know about caring? Have you ever seen the inside of one of those places? The laughing and the tears, and the cruel eyes studying you. My mother there? But she's harmless. She's as harmless as one of those stuffed birds.
I am sorry. I only felt... It seems she's hurting you. I meant well.
People always mean well. They cluck their thick tongues and shake their heads and suggest oh so very delicately. Of course, I've suggested it myself, but I hate to even think about it. She needs me. It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you?
So we've already talked about the idea of madness in horror when we talked about Grand Guignol, but as far as the origins of madness in cinema, they can go all the way back to German Expressionism from the silent era, movies like Dr. Caligari. which is a great horror movie about being insane, all the way up through the 50s when you get movies like Night of the Hunter. A real great early example of a film about a psycho killer, though, from the 40s is Jacques Tournier's The Leopard Man from 1943.
Like the bat or the cat and the canary, a killer associates themselves with an animal in this. I just wanted to point out that connection point to old Dark House films.
Right, which will come up in a couple slashers, but kind of dies out in this era.
This is a crucial element, the psycho killer. This is what makes it interesting, is... And it kind of backsteps when we get to chapter 4, you'll see. But this idea of the psycho, which hasn't met up with the old Dark House style mystery yet. They're kind of existing as separate genres at this point.
We'll get the perfect culmination in those a little bit later with another William Castle movie. But for now, The Leopard Man.
Really, that's the perfect one. The Leopard Man actually does have the element of mystery, which is great.
Yeah, it starts off with there's a killing, which is by a leopard, and then more killings start happening, and people think that it's this escaped leopard, but one detective, or not even a detective, he's like a manager for a stripper, he starts to suspect that it's actually a human committing the murders.
Once again, we've got a Scooby-Doo element here, right? Yeah. Where it's like someone killing in a monster's guise, like the bat or the cat, and yet...
trying to play it off like an act of nature.
Right, and I think... even doing it with some sort of weapon that makes it look like claws. Once again, we got the claws thing going on, right?
Well, that'll come up in slashers when a lot of people, they'll find corpses and they'll think it was an accident. Yes. And they won't know that there's a psycho killer till later on.
Right, yeah, that is a recurring trope. I just want to say about The Leopard Man for a moment. I actually really enjoyed this film.
It was good. It was a lot better than other Jacques Tournier horror movies. I liked it more than I Walked with a Zombie or The Cat People.
Yeah, those are not good. Also, the beginning has perhaps the most frustrating death scene since ever, and then later Rituals will be the more frustrating one. But remember, this girl goes out to get like tortillas for her mom because it's Mexico.
Okay, so we thought it took place in period era Spain, like turn of the century Spain. I looked it up on Wikipedia. It's supposed to be a town in New Mexico.
New Mexico.
But it's not at all. It's period era Spain.
Yeah. Anyway, the point. Anyway, this girl goes out to get tortillas. There's a leopard on the loose. It's a panther. It's a fucking panther. And it attacks her and kills her. And there's a scene where she's knocking on the door going, "Mom, please let me in. If you ever loved me, let me in the door." And then she goes, "Mom." And the mother of this girl goes, "Oh, now she's in a rush when she kept me up all night waiting for the tortillas." And she doesn't open the door.
She's like, she'll learn her lesson when I don't open the door for her while she's being murdered.
And then blood seeps under the door and she feels bad. Yeah, you should feel bad.
Let me in! Let me in! Let me in! If you love me, let me in!
Mamacita, let me in. Let me in now that I've spent half the night getting the cornmeal.
He's coming! He's coming closer! I can see it!
Just what she needs, someone to nip at her heels and hurry her up. Wait there, Essa. I come. I will let you in. Only a moment, querida. Your mother is here.
You should feel bad. But I think what really makes this movie a good proto-slasher is the ending.
Yeah, it has a great moment where these guys finally they find out who the killer is, they confront him, and his reason for why he's been killing is such a great example of a psycho killer's reason.
Right. It's kind of an era where psychology was becoming more mainstream, so people would be aware of like neurosis, would be aware of someone who thought they were someone else or thought they were an animal or had some sort of delusion. You know, that was something that was more, it's kind of the themes of the Grand Guignol, right? People in the Grand Guignol play we read earlier, these women have a delusion that there's a bird living behind this young woman's eyes. Yeah. And in this guy has a delusion that he's the leopard, and it's when he saw someone get killed by the leopard, it created this neurosis.
You don't understand. Nobody understands. You don't know what it means to be tormented this way.
Tormented? Why?
I couldn't rest. I couldn't sleep. All I could see was Teresa Delgado's body. Broken. Mangled. I saw it day and night. It was waiting everywhere I turned.
And then you found the leopard.
I didn't want to kill, but I had to. I heard the little girl in the cemetery talking to the man in the auto. When he went away, I thought I was going to help her get over the wall. I can't remember. I looked down. In the darkness, I saw her white face. The eyes full of fear. Fear, that was it. The little frail body, the soft skin, and then she screamed.
And his scene of confession is very similar to a scene of confession from a movie M from German Expressionism, which was maybe the first film to very dramatically tackle a psycho killer.
Right.
Which we didn't talk about. But
that's German Expressionism as well, which is a huge influence on psycho films.
Yeah. So that's another way that this makes it to America.
Right.
Where an American movie is now drawing from these German films.
And apparently there's a film noir I haven't seen.
There's a film noir called Without Warning. I'm only going to mention this briefly. From 1952, the majority of the movie is procedural. It's actually like the most procedural I've ever seen, where a narration explains fingerprinting to the audience and like stuff like that. It's really interesting. It's
painfully procedural.
No, but it's like, because it was the 50s, like that hadn't been drilled into your head yet.
It wasn't a trope that everyone would know.
But it's a great movie. But half of it follows the cops, which makes it a noir. The other half follows the killer, so there's no mystery. We're seeing the killer, and it does something that I think is the first time that's been done on film, where the killer is grooming his next victim. He's following around this flower shop girl and fantasizing about her and getting close to her and planning on murdering her and murdering other women who remind him of her, all in the build-up to kill her in this big romantic gesture.
You can have your picture back.
My picture?
I won't need it anymore. Going out to your car. Don't make a sound.
And I don't know if that had been done before. We'll see that again later with a movie like Peeping Tom, but it's unclear. I think that might be the first time a movie did that.
Another time a movie did that was in 1959 with Roger Corman's A Bucket of Blood. And this movie, we want to be very clear what Harry was just saying. Our definition of a slasher requires that the slasher villain be a mystery. If you know who the killer is from the beginning and it's like a character study of a killer, it's a psycho film, which is what we're discussing now.
Right, that's what generally separates this movie from slashers. That's where the Psycho and the Old Dark House meet, is creating that.
Exactly. And if it's a film that just studies someone who's insane, from watching them and knowing they're the killer the whole time with dramatic irony because the victims don't know, that's not a slasher or even a proto-slasher. A Bucket of Blood is actually really good. It's where, who's that actor?
Dick Miller.
Dick Miller plays a weird, intellectually delayed man working in a
beatnik coffee shop.
Beatnik coffee shop. Great parody of beatnik culture.
In the 50s. It takes place. It's very culturally aware of its time. It's 1959.
And it's parodying. It's basically like if a comedy came on Netflix right now about hipsters and someone killing hipsters.
It's like it's the Portlandia of its time.
Yeah, totally. It's half horror, gruesome, and also totally a mockery of beatniks.
Which I think is its strongest suit. Is it's a great satire.
It's a good satire.
It's funny. It's goofy. It really gets at what it's doing. And the killings. It is a one-by-one kill, but it's like, it's definitely not slasher.
Yeah, it is.
It has no mystery to it.
You do have that quickening of pace, that narrowing of focus, as it doesn't have a set of characters who die, but it does. You do watch this character who kind of gets pushed into his first murder accelerate and accelerate and accelerate. So what it's about is this guy who just works tables. He's like a busboy at this beatnik nightclub. He is being mocked all the time for not being artistic. While we had a long discussion about how when I was a kid I loved beatniks. I loved On the Road, Burroughs, Naked Lunch, all that shit. I now see beatniks as
they're corny.
They're lazy is the main thing. Is it's like anything is art, whatever. I just say a poem and I never forget it, you know. Mm-hmm. And then this guy, he buys right into that. He hangs out with this girl who like gives him some weed or some heroin. I think she gives him some heroin.
Yeah.
And then an undercover cop is like, I caught you with heroin, so you're going to jail forever unless you like snitch. And he's like, please leave me alone. So this cop is asking for it clearly, and he murders
kills him with a pancake pan.
Oh yeah.
And makes him into a statue called Murdered Man.
I was just making some pancakes. You can have some if you like. Did you see my cat?
Yeah, I saw your cat. I also saw that chick lay these on you.
Oh, that was Naolia. She's a nice girl. She's kind of strange, though. I guess she figures I get headaches or something.
Okay, Walter, who's your connection?
Connection?
Yeah, connection. Who do you score from? Where do you buy your horse?
Horse?
Horse, junk, white stuff, heroin.
Is that what that is? I never seen any of that before. I always thought that was expensive.
Yeah, Walter, that can be real expensive.
Gee, Well, wasn't that nice in Aeolia to give me that expensive horse?
Walter.
Huh?
Police officer.
Oh, you're like an undercover man.
You're under arrest, Walter.
Under arrest for what?
Possession of narcotics.
For me? What are you talking about?
Walter, I got you cold. Now you just come along quietly.
I didn't do nothing. And Aeolia give me those. I didn't ask her for it. I didn't even know what was in that.
All right, you can tell them that downtown. Now let's go.
I ain't going no place with you.
Walter, do I have to point this at you?
You're gonna shoot me. No, don't shoot me.
Walter, just relax.
No, you're gonna shoot me.
Now, just relax.
No, don't shoot
Just
me.
shut up, Walter.
No, you're gonna shoot me. Don't shoot.
Right,
and becomes famous for his art.
And the beatniks fall in love with his shit. Then it accelerates. He kills a cat. He kills a woman.
He kills the cat first, but he kills a woman
who makes fun of him.
Somebody discovers it. He kills some guy working in an auto yard. It's definitely kind of gruesome for its time.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I guess 1959.
And it's like ramps up. Like the murders get higher and higher. You know, it gets more intense. It's clearly inspired by two previous movies: Mystery of the Wax Museum from '33 and House of Wax from *53, which basically have the same plot. But this is more of kind of a slasher style, I think, in the acceleration.
Well, it also came out a year before Little Shop of Horrors, which was shot with many of the same sets.
Yeah, right. Yeah, with Jack Nicholson. Which Little Shop of Horrors is kind of also a proto slasher. It's about a guy who is committed, who has to commit the first murder, you know, to feed the plant, but then has to accelerate. Yeah, it's a similar kind of vibe, right?
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that's 1959. So the next year is 1960, and we get Psycho finally.
Yeah, and Psycho is the perfect blending of elements because we have the psycho killer and we have the mystery. And we have this kind of intense narrative. There's a mystery, but also there's a dramatic irony because we do know more than the police and more than the people investigating, but we don't know the whole story.
Yeah, we have an idea who the killer is, and the twist of Psycho isn't this is the reveal of the killer. The twist is that mental illness is the motive.
Exactly that.
So that the twist is that there is a psycho killer instead of a motivated killer.
Just to say, if you haven't seen Psycho and you're listening to this right now, you have no business having not seen Psycho. Like, you need to go watch Psycho now.
I don't know why you're here.
Yeah, like, you need to pause this and go watch Psycho. But the thing also that made Psycho interesting is it starts like a caper film. It has what is famously regarded and imitated ubiquitously, which is the psycho switch, which is that the plot starts as kind of a caper.
It's about someone who steals money and goes on the lam.
Right. It's about a woman who steals a bunch of money and runs away with it, and she's trying to escape. So we're in a caper film, and then midway through, she's murdered in a hotel by a crazy person,
and it becomes a murder mystery.
And then the film completely changes focus. It's a fantastic postmodern storytelling technique. We see this utilized, especially, similarly
from Dusk Till Dawn.
I was going to say Malice, written by Aaron Sorkin, has a very similar vibe. And also
Kill List is a great recent movie that does it.
And Hostel by Eli Roth.
Yeah.
Directly, he said in the commentary he was motivated. We follow one character through the first half of Hostel. They die, and we switch to another character we didn't think was the main character.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the Psycho switch. The thing is, and now we're going to discuss Psycho, spoilers ahead. There's a famous murder in his shower, probably the single most discussed scene in film history.
Yeah, easily.
Not even kidding. And every element of it is perfect, and it changed the way we think about fear and horror forever. I mean, it's pointless for us to discuss how important Psycho is to the history of horror. So we'll focus on
that could be a whole episode. We're just going to talk about it in ushering in a wave of Psycho ripoffs and Psycho.
Suffice to say that the twist of Psycho is that you think this kid has an overbearing mother. Norman Bates, who is the owner of this hotel, you think he's just kind of a mama's boy with an overbearing mother. But what you find out at the end, of course, is that his mother has been dead for years. She's a skeleton rotting in a rocking chair. He's fucking crazy, and he thinks he is his mother.
So he dresses up and becomes her and acts like her and murders people in her persona.
This story is inspired by robbings and murders of Ed Gein.
Right, and if you guys don't know the story of Ed Gein, real briefly, he was a grave robber who would wear the skin and dress up to become his dead mother.
He only actually killed 2 women who looked very similar to his mother. And I think Norman Bates only kills 3 people. 2, 3? Can't remember.
He kills 2.
Yeah. So, similar. Mostly what Ed Gein was a grave robber. He was a lonely guy, a mama's boy who lived with his mother till I think he was like in his late 30s.
Yeah.
And then she died, and he went into this complete mania from her death and started wearing dead people's skin
to become her
and his dead mother's clothes. And he killed 2 women who looked like his mother.
It's very much believed nowadays that Ed Gein was intellectually disabled.
Right, well, certainly. And the other thing that's believed, which we have to discuss, is that Ed Gein was a trans woman who grew up in a household that was so sexually repressed that it forced this weird outlet for that energy. And there's an important connection between Psycho and future slasher films, which is that Janet Leigh is the main victim of the most iconic scene in film history in Psycho.
And she is the mother
Jamie Lee Curtis.
And guess where the Lee in Jamie Lee Curtis comes from?
And Jamie Lee Curtis is the first official final girl of slasher history.
Yes.
We'll get to that in episode 2. But I just want to say that Norman Bates, the crazy kid who thinks he's his own mom, he has become such a touchstone of culture. That movie was made in 1960, and you can hear references to him throughout rap in the 90s and the early 2000s.
I'm all about making papes, kid. I killed my mother with a shovel just like Norman Bates did.
Born EMC in any 52 states, I get Psycho, killer Norman Bates.
I'm about Norman, it's Norman Bates with the formative traits. A premature birth that was 4 minutes late. Mother, are you there? I love you. I never meant to hit you over the head with that double head.
Should we discuss some Psycho ripoffs now?
Well, I think this is a really good moment, just in general, aesthetically, to distinguish what makes the difference between a remix and a ripoff, right?
Sure. So why don't we start with a really good example, which is Dementia 13.
So Dementia 13 is Francis Ford Coppola of The Godfather, The Conversation, Apocalypse Now fame. This was one of his first films.
This was his first film that wasn't a porn or wasn't a softcore nudie flick, made under the tutelage of Roger Corman, who brought us A Bucket of Blood 2 years earlier.
Right.
Or 4 years earlier.
I mean, in the title alone, you can tell that movies like Homicidal and Dementia, as it was originally called, were Psycho ripoffs. There was another film called Dementia coming out the same year, so they had to say Dementia 13. The 13 is meaningless.
It never comes up.
It's like the Aquarius and Stage Fight Aquarius.
Yeah. Dementia 13 very much... it kind of mixes the Psycho with the old dark house. It's about a woman goes to an old dark house where a family lives, and they've been living there for generations, and they have a lot of personal drama, and there's a psycho killer going around killing people throughout the place, and there's a past trauma as well with a little girl who died. So it kind of mirrors a lot of those things, and it brings the psycho killer into the old dark house with the past drama and the one-by-one murders.
If you have a hard time telling white people apart, good luck with this movie.
When I showed Nick Dementia 13, I had to say, that's a different woman than the woman we just saw, because I didn't know the first time.
Swear to God, there are 2 blonde women in this film who look exactly the same.
Dude, people from the 50s and 60s just look alike.
It was all about looking as similar as you could.
Yeah.
To a prototype. But also it has the psycho switch because it's about a woman who kills her husband and then goes to like claim his inheritance.
She lets him die.
She lets him die and then claims his inheritance, but then she gets murdered right in the middle.
She gets murdered off about 45 minutes in, and you thought she was your main character.
Right.
But then it turns out that there kind of is no main character, or it's this one brother.
Right. Well, then the other blonde woman becomes kind of the final girl-ish, but then there's also a doctor who's like a Van Helsing figure. But the reason it's not an old dark house film is because, first of all, it's more brutal, and because it eventually has an insane person as the killer for insane childhood trauma reasons. There is an inciting trauma in childhood that led to a delusion that led to the murders. And there's a fantastic scene that it's clearly the remix of the "We All Go a Little Mad Sometimes" speech from Psycho. It's the remix of that, which is the "I Still Have Nightmares" speech from Dementia 13.
So good.
Poor Billy. No wonder you used to get all those nightmares.
Used to. I still get them.
What are they like? Are they terrible?
I don't know. They're more strange than terrible. I'm always a little boy when I'm in my room. It's late. I hear somebody outside making a kind of a scraping sound. I get out of bed, look out of the window, and there's a man climbing up the wall, coming closer toward my window. I yell for my mother, and she comes into the room just as the man is coming in through the window. I hold onto her legs, crying. I'm so small, I only come up to her waist. The man is in the shadows. You can almost recognize him, but not really. He says that he's insane, and that someone else in the room is insane also, and that he's going to nod his head. And when he does, that other insane person will nod their head. He nods, and I look up at my mother, and she's nodding her head. And then she starts laughing at me, and she picks me up in her arms, runs outside, and throws me into the pond.
Oh, Billy, we've all got to get out of here.
Yeah, Dimension 13 is the best of the Psycho ripoffs.
Definitely. It's a remix. It typifies the difference between a remix and a ripoff because Homicidal is a ripoff.
Homicidal is a ripoff. Homicidal was by William Castle, who put out a lot of kind of gimmick horror movies.
Yeah.
He did The Tingler, probably his most famous.
He did House on Haunted Hill.
House on Haunted Hill,
talked about earlier.
And all of his movies had an idea where there would be something special you would have to do in the theater. So The Tingler has a part where the screen goes dark and Vincent Price tells everyone to scream as loud as they can. And this movie has a part where it pauses and it says, if you're too afraid, you have 30 seconds to leave the movie before the finale, which would then be redone by Gaspar Noé in I Stand Alone.
Yeah, exactly. But although it's so unearned.
No,
right?
In Homicidal it doesn't work. In I Stand Alone, what happens after the 30 seconds is pretty disturbing. In Homicidal, it's boring.
Right. It's a really cool gimmick to say you have 30 seconds to exit the theater, but you better fucking deliver after that 30 seconds.
Well, so Homicidal starts as a Psycho movie. It starts with a mystery and a really well done murder. And you don't know what's going on, and that's the first 15 minutes of the movie.
And it has kind of a Psycho switch, but not at the halfway point.
No, at about 15 minutes in, where this woman who you don't really know what her intentions are, or what she's doing, and then she murders someone pretty bloodily and pretty brutally, and it's interesting and engaging, and then she goes to an old dark house and starts hanging out with a family.
It gets boring as fuck.
And it becomes a really boring old dark house movie.
Big reveal at the end, like
the brother from the family, because it's always about a family.
Spoiler alert, if you're going to watch Homicidal, which we don't recommend, is she is her brother. They're the same person.
Right. And kudos to the movie for getting the same actress to dress up as a man.
That was maybe the one part where they went a little into it and tried to do a good job.
Well, the whole time we were watching the movie, we were like, are those fake teeth?
Yeah,
we were just like, what's up with this guy?
I very, very many times in the movie said this is a woman playing a man, and I don't know why. Which also happened in The Old Dark House, which also happened in Pet Sematary. It's kind of a trope, and it goes all the way back to Shakespeare. The woman plays a man plays a woman.
We didn't say that. We were just like, this guy is his voice is weird.
His teeth are
super weird.
But it wasn't, it was his sister. And what it turns out is that it was always a woman who had to pretend to be a man in order to get her family fortune, and at some point really believed she was the man. So once again, very, very outdatedly conflating transsexuality with insanity.
But it also goes back to there's a memory of when his gender was stifled as a child.
Transgender with insanity.
No. But what I'm saying is that is a inciting incident. That's a traumatic incident from childhood, and we'll see that done much, much better in Sleepaway Camp.
Oh, yeah.
Where somebody's sexuality or gender identity is stifled as a youth, and that comes out later violently.
I'm going to say unequivocally that Sleepaway Camp has done that better than any other movie ever made. Better than anything in new queer cinema. Sleepaway Camp has done it, and we will get there. Just to close Chapter 3, there are other films came out right around the same time as Psycho that are about psychos.
There's a Hammer version called Paranoiac, which I barely remember.
They all just have
a different version of...
Someone just opened a fucking thesaurus and was like, look up Psycho. What do we got? Dementia, homicidal, paranoia. And they're just like, we'll make a movie for every single word in the thesaurus, basically.
But the other really good one is Peeping Tom.
Right. Peeping Tom is not a slasher or even a proto-slasher, but it is a psycho film. It's about a crazy killer. And it's the one, I would say, that even though this crazy killer kills people in women in a horrible way, and in sort of a sexualized way, which is part of the slasher trope that we'll eventually get in Chapter 4. He is the most sympathetic of any of these.
It's like sad for him.
Well, he went through a lot, talking about childhood trauma a lot. It's a man who murders women. He works in the film industry. He particularly likes to murder women who are injured in some way. Remember, there's a woman with like a black eye, and he's like, it's beautiful, and he zooms in really close. And we find out later, when he starts to become interested in this woman who he really feels for, his final girl, as it were, who he promises to never photograph, which we know means never kill.
Never murder.
He starts to show her childhood videos of that his father made of him, and his father was some sort of psychologist who used to do experiments where he would see how much fear a young boy could put up with. It's very similar to the makings of the Unabomber, or Henry Lee Lucas, or any serial killer who had a really abusive, psychologically abusive childhood, which is the reality of most serial killers. And so it's like stuff like his dad would have a camera on him and would like throw a lizard on him, and then the boy would wake up screaming, and he would just film it. You know? And this creates a guy who, what he does is he kills women with a knived tripod and makes them watch their own faces as they die.
Yeah. And it really does bring to a head the psycho killer by explaining his full motivation and letting you watch his process, which hadn't really been done before and was super controversial at the time.
It's a great movie.
It's a great movie, and it ruined Michael Powell's career because of that element of it. People were disgusted by seeing a psycho killer in a sympathetic light and seeing his sexualized murders in that regard. Also, this movie carries on what I said about with that warning, in that it shows in detail a psycho grooming his victim and falling in love with a woman, but not being able to express his love without violence.
I think it's really important to note that sympathizing with a psycho killer is not about saying that this is okay or that we should just like forgive it. And it's also not like a political film, but as a social film, if you think about films being like, oh, we're trying to shine light on an issue, then what it's saying is that we need mental health services for people. And we also need to acknowledge, in a culture that maybe is all about men manning up, that there are people who have childhood trauma,
Well, when we, in like part 2 or 3, when we talk about slashers proper, we'll find that slashers are some of the wokest movies of their time.
They really are. A lot of feminism and the mental health rights and stuff like that going on. And people see them as the opposite. And they really aren't. The other thing that's important is that as we're getting towards slashers, it's worth previewing that the important defining factor when we get to the slasher, and we're not there yet, we're still in the 60s with the psycho films, is that they're about growing up the right way and the wrong way. And we see a lot of people in these psycho ripoffs who are growing up the wrong way.
Yeah. So why don't we go across the pond to a country called Italy and talk about some giallos.
A house of high fashion, a dazzling whirl of elegance, of exotic, extravagant beauties. An adventurous journey into the devastating allure of the most sophisticated women and their intimate secrets.
Suddenly, these lace curtains ignite a drama that will lacerate your emotions. Blood and black lace. Who is this shrouded, sadistic, sordid fiend who maims and murders? Why this bloodthirsty orgy, this holocaust of lives? Blood and black lace in bleeding color.
So, Harry, what is a giallo?
So a giallo is kind of like the Italian version of a Penny Dreadful. They were Italian pulp novels, kind of like horror, suspense, mystery novels about mystery killers. And they were called giallos because giallo is Italian for yellow. And they were all identified by this one publisher that had a yellow bar at the top of the book. So when they'd be lined up on the bookshelf, you'd see the yellow bar, the giallo bar, and you would know that's a giallo, a mystery killer novel. Cool. Now, those novels...
I love the color yellow.
Yeah, they then translated into film in the 50s when Mario Bava made a movie called The Girl Who Knew Too Much.
Which is a direct reference. We were just talking about Hitchcock with Psycho. It's a direct reference to Hitchcock's film, which he made twice, The Man Who Knew Too Much.
And giallos are very much Italian versions of Hitchcock thrillers.
Yeah.
The only difference is...
Sexier, gorier, and they very much focus on mystery killer. Yeah. And they are not as bad always as the William Castle films, but they're not Hitchcock. They cheapen the techniques a bit.
A lot of them cheapen the techniques. There are a couple hits in the thing. We'll do a whole... We did a brief giallo episode a couple years ago, in our classic episodes, but we'll do a full Giallo episode. I think there are a couple really great ones, and we're just going to talk today about the ones that directly influence slashers.
Right, and the person who is often cited as like the Giallo director and who makes it on the 1001 films you must see before you die list, and who people who think they know things about cinema always tout as a great director, is Mr. Dario Argento, who made Suspiria and some other movies we'll talk about. Deep Red, right. But the guy who really got the whole thing started
is Mario Bava, who made The Girl Who Knew Too Much, who made Blood and Black Lace, and Dario Argento is just kind of doing a more technologically advanced version of Mario Bava.
Just a more colorful, really.
Mario Bava is where all the color comes from. Mario Bava did the set direction for Dario Argento's movies.
Mario Bava's first perfected Giallo, and very much a proto-slasher, is Blood and Black Lace from 1964.
And Blood and Black Lace has the Then There Were None setup, where it's a confined atmosphere. It takes place in a modeling school, or like a fashion house, whatever you call it.
Yeah.
And it's one location and the surrounding village, I suppose.
So the village is the location. It's a bit bigger than a building.
Right, but the majority of it surrounds this location.
Yes.
And there is a mystery killer killing people off one by one. This also introduces an element that you don't see in previous movies, which is that the other people don't realize that the characters have been killed off. They just think that they're missing.
Yeah, this will become... it's not in every slasher, but in like a majority of slashers, there's this plot that as the murders happen, no one's even aware of them.
Right, they just think that person left.
Right, like, and then there were none. Every murder is well known, but this element of like dramatic irony, as we said before, where the audience knows people are dying, but the characters don't know people are dying.
And that's a new trope that I think is introduced in this era.
Yeah, I think it is. Also, we've got some other tropes. First of all, going back in time, this is similar in some ways to a Shakespearean tragedy because it's one murder, and the killers only mean to do one murder at first. You find out when the reveal happens, but the one murder creates complications that lead to all the other murders.
Right, and this is a very
like
Giallo.
Macbeth,
this is a very Giallo thing of they forego the psycho killer in this movie specifically, and it's a very motivated, self-interested murder.
It's like a soap opera. There's so many like stories crossing over, but the thing that's good about Blood and Black Lace is it's well shot, good music, good acting, really good tone. These are the things that become really influential in the slasher. There's a masked killer.
A lot of like nudity and sexualized violence.
Yes, and I want to just say that sexualized violence in Giallos is, you could say, the living metaphor that we discussed earlier, but I think it might just be for pure exploitative reasons. But the way that American slashers reinterpret it, even though it's viewed as just for exploitative reasons, I would actually argue is the living metaphor, is for high artistic reasons. But here we see the introduction that you couldn't do in the 60s with Psycho as much, even though that film was also considered controversial for nudity.
Yeah. But Blood and Black Lace, 1964, it does these things for the first time, and it does gore in color for one of the first times.
Yes.
The first time we're getting a mystery killer, and there are gory murders in full color.
I really liked this film. I watched it with Brooke the other night, and I said, can we watch this old... We went and got some Italian food, and then I said, can we watch this old Italian horror movie? And of all the Giallos we've watched, and there are some bad Giallos.
Yeah, it's not... I love Giallos, but it has its fair share of bad apples.
Yes, I like Giallo too, and one day we'll probably do a whole Giallo episode, because we're only touching briefly on the tip here. Touching briefly on the tip of the iceberg here. But Blood and Black Lace is charming. It's a really good flash of 1960s Italy. It's got cool Italian style with the eyebrows. They really did a lot with the eyebrows back then. And also, it's got this kind of playfulness to it, almost like Clue or Cat and the Canary or something like that.
Right, it's very fun and engaging.
Even though the murders are brutal and very kind of... sexualized in a way that I feel like was exploitation. And then the final reveal, which I'm not going to try to explain, is so convoluted that it's got all the joys of a soap opera. It's like Days of Our Lives or something.
That's what this movie retains from the old Dark House era, and that's what slashers will eventually get rid of this and become slashers, but Giallos retain the complex characters, the complex motivation, and the overwhelming plot, which is only to their detriment.
Yeah, I think. It really is. It detracts from the suspense.
It really does. You can't have... This is something we'll talk about a lot when we talk about a movie later on this list, and we talk about Giallos in general. When tension ratchets up, you can't then step backwards to explain plot.
No.
That's the worst thing a movie can do, and that's something that very many Giallos do.
Too many. The one thing that Dario Argento deserves credit for, and he gets credit, this film is on the 1001 Films You Must See Before You Die list. The Bird with the Crystal Plumage from 1970 is a Dario Argento film. It's pretty good. It's not great. I really prefer, as Harry does, Mario Bava to Dario Argento. Mario and Dario. Don't get confused. But The Bird with the Crystal Plumage is similar to Blood and Black Lace. There's a mystery killer. People are being killed off. The killer wears a raincoat. There's some good suspenseful sequences. And in the end, it's for psychotic reasons. But I think that we really get the first proto-slasher without psycho reasons. We still haven't joined completely. Even though Dario Argento touches it in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, we get our first proto-slasher still missing the psycho element. And the first really important proto-slasher of Giallos that would be almost directly remade as an American slasher is A Bay of Blood, also known as Twitch of the Death Nerve, also known as Chain Reaction, from 1971.
This movie's Mario Bava, again, in 1971. He's taking the same formula from Blood and Black Lace, but he's moving it to a lake, or a bay, rather, instead of a house of high fashion. So now we're getting the rural setting that we will get in so many later slashers, and the woods by the lake setting, which will come up directly in Sleepaway Camp, Friday the 13th, The Burning, all those sorts of movies.
Right. That'll be our first chapter of part 3. Also, there's teenage characters, teenage victims, and we get to kind of the first sort of slashery scene in any movie ever. Even though we've got some sexualized violence in Blood and Black Lace and in Bird with the Crystal Plumage, the fact of the matter is, in this, you have teenagers who drive out to the country. In Bay of Blood, teenagers drive out to the country, party, drink, swim naked, have sex, and then get murdered.
And they get murdered while they are having sex. Well, the one woman gets murdered while she's naked. Then the other couple gets stabbed through with a spike or a spear while they're having sex, which will later be literally remade in Friday the 13th Part 2.
Part 2, yeah.
With Kevin Bacon.
This is the important thing that I really want to get to. Slashers are meaningful not because they are exploitative, but because they are living psychoanalysis. They are about puberty, and Giallos weren't about this, but Bay of Blood in this aspect is. They're about puberty, they're about transformation and adolescence, and death is representative of all those things. And instead of making it like an allegory for death, they create death as a living metaphor, as a symbol within. So when teenagers are having sex and get stabbed with the spear, that violence is there to indicate sort of this psychosis, because remember the psycho killer aspect. However, Bay of Blood doesn't really have that, because there isn't a psycho killer.
No, Bay of Blood very much is motivated killers. They're killing for inheritance money, and it's a bunch of...
Old Dark House film again.
And then this is the big problem, and this is the problem with Giallos. It ratchets up tension. There are murders, there are more murders, you don't know who the killer is. Then you take a back seat as they literally do a flashback, like for 15 minutes, to explain the plot and explain certain character motivations, and suspense takes a back seat to soap opera character relations.
Yeah. I mean, look at how, and we will do a whole chapter on this later, but look at how Friday the 13th, which is an American reimagining of A Bay of Blood, does the killer backstory explanation. It does it in about 30 seconds with Miss Voorhees giving a speech about Jason.
Yeah, you don't need a flashback. No. You don't need a lot of people talking in a room.
And the speech explaining the past actually ratchets up the tension rather than bringing it down. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're like getting so, invested in all these murders happening, and then it decides to go back to a conversation in someone's parlor.
Well, that's when we talk about Giallos more, the biggest difference between Mario Bava and Hitchcock is that Hitchcock understood that once you build up tension, you keep it going, and you don't suspend it.
Right, and also the quickening of pace, which we talked about before, the narrowing of focus that we got from And Then There Were None, that we got in other slashers, or proto-slashers, where it got easier to follow the story and the momentum built up as characters died. It's negated if the character who just died is then shown in a flashback. Now I have to think about them again.
Well, no, more than that, they introduce more plot in the end. And this isn't, we're complaining a lot about this. This isn't just Bay of Blood. There are so many Giallos that do this very thing.
And Old Dark House films do this too.
Yeah, there's a movie called Who Could Torture a Duckling? That's otherwise a very good movie until the last 20 minutes when
you're combining who could kill a child with Don't Torture a Duckling.
Don't Torture a Duckling. That's exactly what I did. Don't Torture a Duckling, which is otherwise a very good movie until the last 20 minutes when suspense takes a back seat to characters in rooms talking.
Yes. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea. I guess they thought that people really cared about the convoluted Days of Our Lives, General Hospital, As the World Turns, One Life to Live.
There's so much stuff in Day of Blood
explanations
about who's sleeping with who and who made an arrangement with who.
Who gives a fuck? And the more interesting explanation and the cleaner explanation, in line with the theme of the living metaphor of adolescence, is that it's a psycho.
Yeah.
Is that it's someone who's lost their mind because of a traumatic childhood. And that's the element that's missing from Giallos.
Well, that is also... You get that a little... The thing that really saves this movie is the last 2 minutes, the very ending, and it is a little hint at traumatic childhood.
Right. So, spoilers.
It's like a peek at what you could get later.
That's a really good point. So talk about the ending. First, I'll set you up. That we realize that the killers are this couple who, like fucking Cat and Canary or Night of Terror, they are trying to get an inheritance after someone died. And this whole scheme has been to kill off everyone so they can get the inheritance. I don't know why they had to kill the teenagers.
I don't know. They killed everybody, and they left their kids in an RV in the woods, and they come back to their kids, and their kids shoot them with a shotgun. Yeah. And then the one kid says, "Gee, Mom and Dad are real good at playing dead."
Well, all's well, it ends well.
Right. Mommy, Daddy. Gee, they're good at playing dead, aren't they? Hey, let's go down to the bay.
And they run off down to the lake to play.
Exactly.
Because to them, murder is something you do on a daily basis. It's a fun, everyday thing, because they see their parents do it so much.
Yeah, and after watching this whole violent soap opera, the slasher is foreshadowed.
Yeah, that is the birth of our Jason, our Freddy, but that's only the last minute of the movie. That's not the majority of the film.
No. It's a good ending, though.
It really is. That ending makes up for some boring previous 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. Now, these aren't the end-all, be-all Giallos. There's other good Giallos. There's a director. What's the director's name?
Sergio Martino.
So Sergio Martino really leaned hard into the sexual aspect of Giallos.
Right, which the Italians generally like to do about any type of genre.
Sergio, say it again?
Sergio Martino.
Sergio Martino made a film called Your Vice is a Locked Door and Only I Have the Key, also known as Gently Before She Dies. And it's a interpretation of Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Black Cat, which is about a woman who kills her husband.
No, other way around.
Husband who kills his wife and puts her in the wall.
Corpse behind,
and then the cat leads the police to the corpse.
Exactly.
It's the opposite. It's the wife who kills her husband in this version. But this is like half murder movie giallo, half porno, and really leans hard into the sexual violence and racist violence too, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
There's a black character who they call bad names and who dies. Not going to shy away from that.
Yeah.
But it's like half porno practically, and the sexual violence feeds into the beginning of this living metaphor for slashers that sex and violence are conflated because of the sex and death. It's the basic psychoanalytic tropes. They build up any demented psyche.
Well, the next year he made a movie called Torso, and this actually brings us to the end of Giallos and the end of our first part.
By all accounts, the first slashers were made in 1974, and this last Giallo we're going to be discussing was in 1973. So we're right on the cusp.
Yeah, this was the kind of the tipping point for a new genre to begin.
The moment that tipped us into the tipping point.
Yeah. So 1 year before the first slashers, this movie Torso, which starts off, it has a mystery killer. It has teenagers at university in Rome.
It has a psycho killer, too.
Psycho killer. Well, we don't know that till later on. But it also has the overt sexual themes. And it uses a lot of the Giallo-style suspense.
A journey into the bizarre, terrifying world of the psychosexual mind. Torso. It saturates the screen with terror.
It's got some really great near the end suspense sequences. It's kind of dull in the beginnings, but this movie does suspense a lot better than the earlier Mario Bava movies.
It does, and the sexualized violence also becomes important because the killer has a sexual paraphilia, like Norman Bates.
Yeah.
And that starts to become a trope that's important to these, is the fact that sex is a trigger for the killer.
So Torso is the first movie, then, that takes the one-by-one murders, although it doesn't do that perfectly to a slasher format, but it gets kind of close. One-by-one murders, Hitchcockian suspense, and a psycho killer.
It's important to go back and note something that is often seen in slashers is that it's a reduced stereotype that I don't feel is entirely true, that the girl who survives is the virgin and the girl who dies first is the slut. I don't think that trope is accurate. I think that's a simplification. But you start to see that in movies like Torso, and if you go all the way back, Psycho, the famous kill scene is in a shower. Mm-hmm. You could say that a shower is a sexual trigger that set off the killer as well. This is not a morality play to punish the victim. The whole idea is that the killer's concept of sex is violence.
Right. The killer is supposed to represent the most extreme elements of those moralities.
And the most extreme arrested development malreaction to sex and sexual...
Sex makes them violent and crazy, so that's why they kill the most sexual.
It's about how that is wrong, and about how we should study that there are people in society who have filtered their sexual response in that direction.
Right. It's actually very sexually liberal.
You would say, right, because it's about how we need sex-positive childhoods or we turn into slashers.
But it's also exploitative, and who knows what came first. We can also interpret it as being that in 2017, but I feel like Sergio Martino just wanted to see some boobs and then wanted to see some blood, and he was like, let's put those together.
Dario Argento directly said, I like seeing attractive women die. I mean, and so the fact is, in Giallos, we're not pretending that these dirty old men Italian directors were doing it for any other reason than for sexualized violence. We're saying that when this idea was filtered through slashers, it became something new, and it became something more metaphorically important. And that's why these films matter. Whereas Giallos, you really can't get around, especially with the Sergio Martino ones like Torso and Your Vice is a Locked Door and Only I Have the Key. They are softcore pornos with murders mixed in, which is weird. It's a weird thing to do.
Well, in Torso, spoilers, the killer's the priest.
Oh, yeah.
So there is commentary. There is a lot of commentary about, you know, the killer kills because he wants to suppress sexuality.
Catholicism will come up again in Slashers Part 2 when we talk about Alice, Sweet Alice.
Yes.
So we're arriving at the end of Part 1.
Yeah.
1973, Torso came out. In 1974, two American films, which we will discuss in the next part, came out that began the turning point into the slasher film.
Yeah, and we'll tease you with what those are.
I'm going to kill you.
Alice!
I come back for you later, girlie.
Michael?
But why don't we say a little bit to say farewell about our podcast?
Yes.
And what we're doing.
So we're going to do two more parts of this. Part 2, The Turning Point, and Part 3, An American Genre, to finish out slashers for our Halloween season. We just want to say, please tell, if you think you have any friends who are interested in film history or obscure media, please tell them about our podcast. Please tell them to subscribe.
Yeah. We are a DIY operation. We're like the Black Flag of podcasts. We have 2 stands with a curtain hanging on one side of a table and some rubber covering the windows and 2 $90 microphones.
Yeah. Plugged into GarageBand.
So we're doing the best we can, and we're trying to spread the word.
Once again, shout out to Anthony Vigil for all this equipment. Please visit cinematicoblivion.com. Not only do we have all the episodes curated there, but we also have show notes. We also have a page about us, and we also have extras, including a playlist I made for cheerleader camp, and also the old blogs that we used to do. Please tell your friends about us. We're going to be putting show notes up for these episodes that are going to include any links to the films we discussed if you want to go watch them.
And if you have any questions or comments about any of the movies we talk about or any movies that we will eventually talk about or you want us to talk about, please email us at cinematicoblivion@gmail.com. Taking all mail. Send us any questions you got.
Yeah, it's okay. Please, just get in touch with us with all you can. We are going to try to make this as easy for you to navigate as possible. If you go back to our past episodes, we have links to Osterns, we have links to Saragossa manuscript materials, and so on. So thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe, make sure to share, And we will be back for part 2, which goes. This episode we went from 1200 BC to 1973,
and on the next episode,
so we had to move pretty quickly.
Yeah, but we'll slow down our pace, and the next episode we'll get back to you. We will join you next week with the History of Slashers Part 2 from 1974 to 1978.
Thanks for listening.